Okay, we're starting a new chapter, a new section in the textbook. This is on evolution, and we're going to define evolution and natural selection and describe the evidence that supports evolution. Um, this is one of the basic ideas, kind of like Mendel's idea, very, very important. There is some pushback on this though, because it kind of some people think it contradicts with their personal beliefs, and I think it's really important to recognize what is a theory. A theory is an idea that explains existing evidence and observations. It makes testable predictions, and it was supported by new evidence. Okay, a theory is something that is in science. It's the our best estimate of what is true. Okay, and the theory of evolution is about 175 years old, although the ideas go back much farther than that. These two guys here are the guys that first came up with the idea of evolution and proposed a mechanism. On the left there, that's Charles Darwin, which you've probably heard about. But on the right is another guy that came up with the idea at the same time, and I'll tell his story later. That's Alfred Wallace. Um, and these guys, uh, they were raised in an environment where they were asking questions about variations in organisms and the distribution of species and if species were fixed. And they came to believe that there was a lot of variation in populations, and some of that variation was genetic. And if that was true, and some of that variation made individuals better at surviving and reproducing, that would mean that the organisms would likely change. And so evolution is basically just inherited change, genetic change in a population of organisms, which is a change in which genes are common. Over time, this can produce new adaptations and new species. We think of evolution from progressive change from simple to complex and having transitional forms. Natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution occurs, and that's just differential reproduction of individuals based upon their genotypes. Individuals that have better genes in an environment are more likely to survive and reproduce and more likely to leave their genes. There's a lot of misconceptions. Evolution is not the survival of the fittest or the toughest. It's survival of those who survive. It might be better parents are more likely to leave more offspring. Individuals that might be better at hiding or better at surviving periods where there's no food. It's not survival of the toughest or strongest. It's not necessarily a struggle. It's just survival. And there's lots of evidence that supports this. In fact, an overwhelming amount. And so I've just got a list here. And the biologists that came up with this idea, they amassed a wide variety of evidence to support this, and it was an overwhelming amount. And so it's listed here: artificial selection, fossils, natural experiments, anatomy and embryology, in biogeography, and molecules. Among the most important evidence was from agriculture, and that was artificial selection. Biologists were arguing if species were fixed or not, if they could change over time. And agriculture showed, of course, they could. Okay, we're selecting and producing new breeds of dogs, cats, cows, horses, corn, wheat, sheep, all sorts of things over time. People selected, they chose desirable traits, and they selected who could reproduce. And this produced large changes. You could produce everything from a Great Dane, if you selected for size, all the way down to a Chihuahua. Okay, and there was evidence that there had been change over time. The fossil record showed organisms in the past did not always very much resemble organisms that were present now. Here's a fossil of Archaeopteryx. It's an animal that looks halfway between a bird and a reptile. It has teeth in its jaws. It has a bony tail. These are very reptilian traits. It has claws on its forelegs, but you can also see clear impressions of feathers and wings. It's a transitional fossil. And the fossil record, we know the Earth is old. There's been lots of time for change to occur, and we see change. The older the fossils are, the less they look like organisms from now. The oldest fossils are bacteria. The oldest fossils are marine life. It's much later where you get land plants and vertebrae. As over time, there's increasing similarity to living species, but there's lots of unusual fossil intermediates. We can also see in the anatomy of organisms alive now, in their embryos, we see similarities in structure due to common descent. And so here's a forelimb of a bunch of mammals. Clearly, they all show the same basic patterns. Even those that fly and swim have one upper arm bone, two lower arm bones, and then increasing numbers of bones. We see lots of different structures that that show that organisms were descended. We call these similarities based on common descent homologies. Okay, and we do a lot of comparison of how structures develop in embryos, and we can see all vertebrate embryos are very similar early and become more and more different as they developed. All vertebrate embryos have pharyngeal pouches that in fish develop into gills, but in humans those pouches disappear or develop into glands and ducts. We also see evidence that evolution modifies existing structures to produce workable but imperfect solutions. Like long necks in some organisms are just lots of vertebrae, but in mammals, it appears that the number of vertebrae is fixed in the neck at 7. So mammals like the giraffe with a long neck just have very, very large vertebrae. That's not true of other animals, reptiles or birds. They just have extra vertebrae. We also see vestigial structures that the animal has gotten rid of, but now still has remnants of, even though they don't use them at all. Here you see a remnant of a snake leg on a boa constrictor. You see appendix and gills in humans. In whales have hip bones. They don't have any external legs. They don't use their hip bones for anything, but they still have those. One important feature early on for early biologists was the distribution of plants and animals over the world. And biologists asked, why are there so many species? And why do certain species occur in certain places and not others? Islands in particular have fewer species than mainland areas, but they have lots of unusual species that are found only in that place. However, those species often resemble the nearest mainland. One example of that is islands, particularly isolated Pacific islands, have lots of flightless birds. And it's probably because these birds reached the island and began to adapt to the conditions there. And because there were no predators, they didn't need to fly. And flying can be dangerous if you're blown off the island. Likewise, there's also, we can look at the similarities in molecular structures and proteins and DNAs. And we can see that that corresponds to how recent common ancestor organisms share. And so these similarities go all the way down into the molecules. So to summarize, there's lots of evidence that species aren't fixed, that genetic change is occurring in populations now and has occurred in the past and has given rise to new species. Okay, and so we're going to talk in more detail about how we came up with this idea, kind of what it means, and what applications it has. All right, so this won't be on the exam that's on Monday, but it will be on the exam for the next section. So we'll resume talking about this on Wednesday.